Now we're going to consider what's sometimes called the writings in Scripture, and of course by that it's Psalms and wisdom literature. We'll cover Psalms first and then wisdom literature as a whole. Somebody once said that if, this wouldn't be an ideal situation, but nevertheless, if we somehow lost the Old Testament but had Psalms, we would still have the content of the Old Testament. And I think that's largely true. Regardless of the way we sometimes think about Psalms, Psalms contains everything. God is creator. There are Psalms of history that recounts all of Israel's history. There's prophetic type Psalms. They're talking about the future. There are Psalms that have blessings and curses in them. There are, as I said, there's historical Psalms. There's Psalms about the coming Messiah. You name it, it's in the Psalms. The Psalms are, in some senses, probably the Psalms are maybe one of our favorite parts of the Bible. We're all familiar with Psalms. My guess is all of you have a Psalm memorized. Or you could quote big parts of it, like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," etc. Psalm 23, obviously. So we love to read the Psalms for good reason. And for centuries, the Psalms was pretty much the hymn book of the church. And there's still some churches, and that's the Psalter is their hymn book. And that's what they read. And again, like most of us memorize Psalm 23. If you grew up in a church, you probably memorized Psalm 23 as a child. My guess is. And if you memorized it wherever you were in the King James Bible, and then all of a sudden you read it in some other one, now it's even something like that, sort of I don't know about you, but when I recite texts that I've memorized, every translation comes out of my mouth. All right, and sometimes none. And so, but the Psalms we're really familiar with. Many, 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 many praise and worship type choruses that we sing in all of our churches are based or paraphrases of Psalms. Right? We're pretty much surrounded by them. I guess the first thing I would say is that the Psalms are songs and prayers and laments and celebrations of the redeemed, of those in a covenant relationship with God. And that's important to remember. And they're written in that big timeline, not timeline, that big unfolding picture of the Bible. But how does Psalms fit? Think about it. It's easy to see how narrative fits the big picture of the Bible, right? Or even as we saw with the prophets, it's easy to see how if you're doing a big outline of the big picture of the Bible, it's easy to see how you would fit the prophets in there, right? Or much of the Pentateuch. What about Psalms? How does Psalms fit into the big picture of the Bible? Now, of course, there are Psalms that move the picture along prophetically or historically, right? But how do they fit? And the way they fit, I think, is what I just said. The Psalms are the praises, lamentations, celebrations, hope, confession of those who are living in that unfolding story. Because remember, it's not just an objective story out there somewhere that we're observing from afar, or that we're standing on the outside. We're meant to be inside of it. Right? And so anytime you're sharing the big story of the Bible, remember, your goal is to get people to see that they are, in your churches, that they are in that story. And that's how things like the Psalms fit. In the Psalms, you hear the people involved in the unfolding big story of God's plan of redemption. You hear them speaking. You hear them speaking back to God in this relationship. And that's how you think of something like Psalms fitting. It's not so much where does it fit on the big timeline. But what you see there is that you have And one of the ways it fits, there's many more things to say, is it fits in this way, in that the story is our story. And it's a relational story between people and God. And in the Psalms, you hear people speaking to God. Now, have you ever taught or preached on a psalm? You can raise your hand if you have. A few of you have. Was it tough? Depends on what psalm it was. Psalm 51? Is that the one? A little easier, because of there's lots of experiential connections you can make in Psalm 51. What about a devotional psalm? The Psalms can be one of those things where you think, wow, I'm going to do a series on the Psalms. And then you sit down, you read the psalm, and you think, after I read this out loud, I'm not sure what I'm going to say about it. Except maybe read it out loud again. They can be difficult. They're tricky. They're tricky because, like narratives, they're not arguments. Now, they're not random at all, but they're not arguments. You have things stated and restated, but they're not discourse like epistles, clearly. And the fact that when you look at a psalm and you immediately realize this is not Ephesians, you should immediately have in your mind, therefore, I'm not going to read this like Ephesians. And my goal of reading Psalm whatever, 23, 24, 119, my goal is not going to be to, as quickly as possible, turn this into an epistle and read it like an epistle. If you want to preach an expository sermon from Psalms, it should reflect the literature of Psalms, not the literature of Paul. Right? Now, is there overlap? Yeah, of course. It's all language. It's all talking about God and this kind of thing. So I'm not saying it's absolutely different, but the very fact that you recognize immediately that it's kind of a different kettle of fish teaching or preaching a psalm than it is, say, teaching 1 Peter should get your attention, right? That your sermon should reflect that. Your study should reflect that. Your discussion should reflect that. You know, because they're often repetitive. They're often figurative and full of metaphors. And often they seem quite, and we read them, as we should, quite devotionally. And it can be difficult to speak about something that you read devotionally. It's one of those things where you read it and you're sort of overflowing with sort of thoughts about it, but then you discover it doesn't take you long to say everything that was in your mind. And it becomes sort of just reflections. And it can be difficult to preach or teach from them. But they're not difficult to enjoy. They're not that difficult to read. I think the first step is, if you want to learn to read the Psalms, you should follow the advice of Bonhoeffer, who said, if somebody wants to be a theologian, they should sit and pray their way through Psalm 119. Now, whatever you might think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, totally beside the point. But I think that's a good place to start, because these are prayers and songs, and they need to be read as such. Now, the Psalms are basically, in many ways, prayers to God in all kinds of circumstances. And they often contain language that we would be really uncomfortable saying out loud in public. But they all contain language that we've all said in private in one way or another. If you compare the Psalms to some of the prayers that we pray out loud in public, it can be apples and oranges. The psalmists tend to say things that and not the praising psalms, but the psalmists tend to say things that we think but we wouldn't really admit. Because we often would be afraid that people might think we're sort of spiritually depressed, right? And so, rather than just saying what it is, we'll just say, oh, I'm fine, everything's fine, whether we are or not. The Psalms give us the freedom to say, you know what? Everything's not fine. Now, it doesn't mean it's hopeless, because the Psalms also give the answers. But just listen to this. And imagine yourself at church this Sunday. Person comes up to lead in prayer and says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me?" More than one eye would probably open. Right? And again, it's not as if, I'm not necessarily saying that every one of these Psalms was written in a public context. But nevertheless, this is somebody who knows God speak. This is not an unbeliever. This is not an unbeliever speaking. Or listen to Psalm 44. At least I think it's right. Arouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake, get up. Do not reject us forever. Right? This guy would be up for church discipline in 2 seconds, praying this prayer out loud. And again, I'm not saying that now what we have to do now is go the complete opposite direction and just blurt out everything in our prayers. Because it would, again, you have to hear me. I'm not saying that. I'm not talking about some kind of paradigm shift in our prayers. I'm just trying to point out that, again, this is not an unbeliever. Psalm 80, verse 4. Obviously, I'm being very selective. O Lord God of hosts, how long will you be angry with the prayer of your people? You have fed them with the bread of tears, and you have made them to drink tears in large measure. You make us an object of contention to our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. God, restore us and cause your face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Now, of course, they're speaking out, right? God takes his stand, and then God speaks, and then he's called to vindicate the weak and the fatherless. But see, here it's a prayer to God to act forcefully in judgment upon those who are those who are oppressing people. Right? So it's a calling for God to act decisively against people who are committing injustice. Again, we sometimes come closer to doing that, but it's not the kind of thing we say out loud very often. You know, God set things right decisively. Shut their mouths. 89:46. How long, O Lord, will you hide your face forever? Will your wrath burn like fire? And then a final one. Return, O Lord, how long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. Now, I've in many ways violated the principles I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, and that is these aren't the final word from these people. Right? And we'll have a lot to say about that in a second. I just wanted to point out that here are people talking back to God. Now, people will come to these verses like awake and these kind of things, and start to wonder about the sort of existence and attributes of God. But these verses like this from the Psalms are what? Who's saying these things? Tell me a little bit about them, their context. Okay, kings. Who else? Very simple things. Okay, yeah, it's often David on the run. Right? He's crying out, vindicate me according to my righteousness. I haven't done anything wrong. Vindicate me. Some are being oppressed. What's the most fundamental thing we can say about all of them? All of them are members of a covenant in which a covenant God has revealed himself to be a particular way. They don't cry out to God to wake up because they think he's asleep. They cry out in that way because they know he's God and he doesn't sleep. It's because of what they know about God and what they know to be true about God that is causing them anguish in their oppression and in their anxiety and everything else. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? These aren't people who don't know who God is. I don't think these are people who have serious theological questions about whether God really sleeps or whether God is somehow unfaithful to his people. They know he's, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. And so I think what they're doing is they're calling out to God on the basis of who they know him to be. And so what you get is sort of this probing of the depths of the human heart being poured out to God. I think the reason they can pray with such boldness is because they have an idea of who God is. So they plead with God to do what? To do the kind of things he's promised to do. That's what. And that's why, one of the things I did, I kind of violated one of the big things I'll tell you never to do, is I went through selectively and just pulled a verse or two out of, a verse or two here or there out of context. So we need to be careful. We need to be careful. Sometimes the Psalms will contain language about God that sometimes people will bring up and say, it's just like they do in narrative when it talks about God changing their mind. They say, you see, God changes his mind. But what's that language? What's the language of Psalm? What's the language of narratives and those kind of things? Right? It's experiential language. Right? It's written in the course of a narrative, in the course of a psalm, in connection with the experience of the people who are going through whatever. And so what I'm trying to say is, it's kind of like what I said about the parables. The statements about God in the Psalms at every point are not necessarily sort of lists of his attributes. What you have here is you have the experience of people with God. And they're speaking and crying out to God. They're not listing God's attributes all the time. They're talking about their experience of him, or what they feel at that time is some kind of lack of experience with him. And so they'll say things about God and declare things about God that, again, are not necessarily just sort of lists of attributes. I think it's because they know God is eternal, and they know he's unchanging, and they know he's good, and they know he's faithful, and they know he's just, and they know he's righteous, that they'll cry out in these sorts of ways. Because if you go back and read every single one of those things I drew out of context, you'll see things like, vindicate me because of your justice. Hear me because of your love. Fulfill your word. So this points to the first most important principle, and that is, every psalm has to be read in its totality. And not just one verse here or there. But it is important that we pay attention to the language in the Psalms, including that language of lament. Let's just go straight to the hardest psalm of all. Let's not act like it's not there. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Up on the willows in the midst of it we hung our harps. And there our captors demanded of us songs and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing to us, or sing us one of the songs of Zion. Okay, what's going on in this song? Where are they? They're in exile. They're in exile. This is Psalm 137. Right, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Right, so they're in Babylon. They're in exile. They are experiencing what? The curses of Deuteronomy. They're living them. They're living the curses of Deuteronomy. And I think it's fair to say that when the Babylonians come and say, sing us the songs of Zion, I don't think they're just like, sing us the top 40 from Jerusalem. You know, the sort of Hebrew Casey Kasem or something like that. I think what they're saying is, they're talking about what are Israel's songs about. But what are their songs? What are Israel's songs, as far as we can see from the Bible? Israel's songs are songs about their God. Their God who protects them. Their God who provides for them. Their songs are connected to their worship of God. And they're out of their land. And so it's really just salt in the wound. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They're out of the promised land, right? They're not experiencing God's blessing for certain right now. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to the ground, to its very foundation. So they're calling God back to they're calling back to their memory and bringing before God something that's happened. And then they say this, O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one. How blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense for which you have repaid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Now there's a psalm that most of us would not put at the top of the list of top 10 texts I need to preach in the next 10, in the next year. So but if you think about it, and there's no way to make this easy. And that's one of the things we do is we try to come and we try to neuter it. So there's no, and so at the end of the day, you said, well, it's just figurative language. Well, yeah, it's figurative language for something, though. Sometimes we'll say, well, it's just figurative language, but figurative language points to something. It doesn't point to nothing. And it certainly doesn't point to its opposite. Right? The language, where'd it go? The language of verse 9 is not pointing to the opposite, somehow of like cradling babies and putting them to bed quietly with lullabies. I mean, it's not pointing to the 180-degree opposite of what it's saying. It's pointing to something. And whatever it's pointing to is unpleasant. And there's no way around that. There's no way around that. But as we go through a psalm like this, we do have to remember, one, it's a psalm. And things are being expressed in poetic language. So I don't think the picture at the end of the psalm is a picture of people going around joyfully killing children. We have to be first thinking about what is it that's caused them to say such a thing. What is it that's caused them to say something like this? Yeah, their own experience of being dragged into exile by the Babylonians. Right? That's what's pressing it. That's what's giving rise to it. And the language in this psalm is not easier than this. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Where's that from? Yeah, well, yeah, that one happens to be from Mark 13. That's Jesus speaking about something that's going to come. What you have, I think, in Psalm 137, you have the cry of the covenant people of God who are out in exile, and what they're looking forward to is the day when God will absolutely, totally defeat their enemies. That's what it's talking about. I think the dashing the little ones against the rock is reflective of what? Total defeat of Babylon. Babylon will be no more. It sounds like the conquest language, doesn't it, of Exodus or Joshua. The Pentateuch, or I don't know why, just in the Exodus, as they're getting ready to come to the Promised Land. It sounds like the conquest language. It's what they're told to do. Why? What does it symbolize? It symbolizes the eradication of God's enemies. That doesn't make it more palatable. But the thing is this psalm doesn't resolve itself. And I think it's meant not to resolve itself. If it was, there'd be a note of resolution at the end. The way it resolves itself, or the way that it does resolve itself, is it resolves itself with looking forward to a day where God is going to vindicate His people and defeat His enemies decisively. I don't think it's glee over the murder. No, I don't think it's glee over the killing of children, even children of enemies. It's not gleeful, but it is dreadful. Yes?
Can you tie it in with where they say in the law that God will hold responsible the children for the sins of the fathers in the third generation? And then at times He says, but I am also a loving God who will show mercy to 1,000 generations for those that love me.
Yeah, I think. Just let me try to summarize. The statement was connecting it to things like the children paying for the father's sins, and then what was the last thing? Connecting it to.
That He will give mercy for those who love Him to 1,000.
Oh yeah. His mercy from generation upon generation upon generation. Yeah, I think we can't come to Psalm 137 and throw out everything else we know about God in the Bible, which that's sometimes our tendency, right? We're meant to be informed. Psalm 137 should be informed, as it informed those who wrote the psalm and who sang the psalm. Our reading of it should be informed by everything that we know about God in the Bible. And I don't think you're saying this, but at the same time, I don't think that we should take everything else we know about God to be in the Bible and come to this and somehow make it seem like, verse 9 is not as bad as it seems. It's bad. It's ultimate final judgment. And I think that's how we ought to preach it. It's not comfortable. It's not one of those things that's going to make everybody super happy. But what it's talking about is the ultimate final triumph of God. These are His people who are in exile. These are His people who have been, their land's been destroyed, their children have been killed. And now somebody might say, but, it's just vengeance. Well, God has something to say about vengeance as well. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Right? There is a day of deliverance coming when God's enemies were going to be destroyed. And that's what this is pointing to. And it's coming from people who are in a situation beyond almost anything any of us can even imagine. I know I personally can't. I can't sort of experientially enter into the suffering that they're experiencing and what they have experienced. Go read the biblical texts that talk about what's going on in Jerusalem before they're taken off into captivity. Go read it. It's as graphic as this is. And more graphic in many ways. I'm talking about narratives too. Go read about the circumstances in Jerusalem before they were taken off into exile. And then you'll start to a little bit more, all of us will a little bit more start to step into the experience of these people who are saying this. It's easy to read Psalm 137 and to sort of launch off into all kinds of big questions. But the thing we have to do is go back and think, okay, who are these people? Why are they saying this? And how are they saying it? And the way they're saying it is wrapped up in how you read Psalms. Right? This is both this is called an imprecatory psalm. And there's many such psalms in the Bible. And it has to be put in its own context. And I don't think that one of the things we have to do here is come and then give sort of 20 reasons why 20 reasons why some of the things in Psalm 137 are not all there is to say. Of course they're not. But this is something that has to be said. Any questions about Psalm 137 before I move on? If you're still feeling unsatisfied, yeah, you are. There's, in one sense, I think the reading of Psalm 137 always leaves us feeling that way because, again, it resolves itself in the defeat of God's enemies, but it doesn't resolve itself in some of the ways we would like it to. And I think that's precisely one of the points of it, is it doesn't resolve itself out into ways that we wish that it would, to make it more palatable. Now, having said that, the book of Psalms is not just a psalm here and a psalm there and a psalm there. The book of Psalms has been put together in a form. So the end of the story is not Psalm 137. Read into the next psalm. I will give you thanks with all my heart. I will sing praises to you before the gods. I will bow down to you before your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your loving kindness and your truth. For you have magnified your word according to all your name. On the day I called, you answered me. You made me bold with strength in my soul. All the kings of the earth will give thanks to you, O Lord. When they have heard the words of your mouth, they will sing of the ways of the Lord. For great is the glory of the Lord. For though the Lord is exalted, yet he regards the lowly. But the haughty he knows from afar. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you will revive me. You will stretch forth your hand against the wrath of your enemies, and your right hand will save me. The Lord will accomplish what concerns me. Your loving kindness, O Lord, is everlasting. Do not forsake the work of your hands. There you find the resolution of Psalm 137. You don't find it in the middle of Psalm 137. It resolves itself out in the following psalm. And I think the following psalm is not just there because somebody went around. Somebody went around after all the psalms were written and sort of just picked them up and put them together and bound them up. They're ordered. They're put together. That this is true. That this is true is manifestly evident. But the problem is we think of the Psalms as just, it's a collection of stuff, sometimes without connection one to the other. But the outright devastation of the enemies of God in Psalm 137 is followed with what? Verse 4 of the next psalm, all the kings of the earth will give thanks to you, O Lord. When they have heard the words of your mouth, they will sing of the ways of the Lord. And your people will be vindicated, and so on and so on and so on. Psalm 136, if you read up just right above Psalm 137, and we won't read the whole psalm, you start with verse 23 and go through 26. Who remembered us in our low estate, for his loving kindness is everlasting, and has rescued us from our adversaries, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Who gives food to all flesh, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the God of heaven, for his loving kindness is everlasting. And then you go into Psalm 137. Yes.
Does that work?
Yeah. Yeah. Too much can be. Too much can be made out of, but that the Psalms are shaped. Again, that the Psalter is shaped, I think, is beyond question. I mean, just take, for instance, Psalm 1. Just take the way it begins. The Psalms are commonly known as the Psalms of David, right? And you start off with two royal psalms. You start off with the Psalm 1 that looks like the king from Deuteronomy 17, doing what the king in Deuteronomy 17 does. And then what do? You go right into a royal psalm, Psalm 2. And so here you see, once you read, so all this, when I said it never resolves itself, yeah, it never does if you only read Psalm 137. But you see, Psalm 137, this crying out of the people of God in this circumstance is sandwiched between what? A psalm that confirms over and over and over and over again the loving kindness and everlasting loving kindness of God, and one that flows out into what? God's sure salvation, including the bringing in of the nations. And what's so shocking is it's all right there together, but if you start to think about it, this is the content of the Bible. Psalm 137 in many ways doesn't stand out all that much in terms, if you go through and look at other sort of judgment texts. Just go to the book of Revelation. Go to almost the end of the Bible and look at the list of the people who are on the outside who will never come in. Or read the conquest texts. Or again, read the Olivet Discourse from the mouth of Jesus. Or read the prophets. And you'll hear the same sorts of language. It's just one of the things that's so jarring to us is this is in the same book of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. And then you come to Psalm 137. The Psalms are reflecting the whole entire experience of the people of God. And not just the pastoral parts of life. So anyway, again, I don't think that's going to make Psalm 137 all of a sudden people are going to be like, that's my favorite psalm. What's your life verse? Psalm 137, 9. Right? Probably nobody's going to, I'm saying that that's going to happen. I'm not even saying it should happen. But still, I think sometimes we come to Psalm 137 and we abstract it from the Bible and we just talk about what it isn't. But it's important to remember. It's important to remember. I mean, what you have here is you have the future deliverance of God based on something God's done in the past, verse 7. Yet then you have this promise of the future deliverance of God in this poetic language. So knowing the circumstances of a psalm can go a long, 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 long way towards interpreting it. Other examples of this would be like Psalm 51. Do you remember what brings about Psalm 51? Nathan, Bathsheba and then Nathan coming to David. Nathan exposes David. Right? And then you have Psalm 51. And so that's one where you have the context, and that context helps you interpret it. You have Psalms 120 to 130, 134. These are the Psalms of ascent. These Psalms are clearly arranged. Psalms 120 to 134, probably arranged after the exile. And if you take the Psalms of Ascent in Psalm 120, 134, you have 1 and 2. Psalms 1 and 2 are the intro to the Psalter. And if you carefully read verses 146 to 150, you have the close, right? And not just because it's the end of the book. And in the midst of this, right before the end, you have 120, 134 in the Psalms of Ascent that are worship psalms. As worshipers approached the temple, probably at the Feast of Tabernacles, they would recite these psalms. right? Tabernacles, Exodus 23. It's a week of celebration for the harvest. And what did they do? Why did they go out and live in tabernacles or in booths? To commemorate the Exodus from Egypt into the Promised Land. And if you read the Psalms of Ascent, you'll see it's all about deliverance. It's all about God's promises. It's all about the great things that God is doing and will do. So as the worshipers would come up to the temple, they'd recite these psalms together. And so if you were going to teach and preach the psalms and you got to these parts, what would you be emphasizing? Deliverance, provision, and worship. That's what happens in all this whole section of the Psalms. It's all about God's salvation, God's provision for His people and sustaining them, and the worship that flows from that knowledge. Another thing to remember is that often in the Psalms, when you don't have historical context, and you often don't, but this would count even when you do, you have to follow the flow of that whole entire psalm. Take Psalm 73, for instance. Psalm 73, you have a song about the experience of a man who nearly lost it, but then who was restored. Psalm 73 begins like this. Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. It begins with a conclusion. This is a conclusion he came to after the experience that he describes basically through verse 14. And it's a very, very common one, where he looks at the lives of the wicked and says, man, they have everything. I'm righteous, I got nothing. Right? And when he says, but as for me, my feet came close to stumbling, my steps had almost slipped, he's not talking about when you're like walking across the sidewalk and all of a sudden you trip and then act like you're jogging to show that you didn't almost sort of fall down. He's not talking about just slipping. He's talking about falling, being ruined, never getting up again, giving up. But you see, it goes through his whole experience. It goes through his whole experience, and you may well know this psalm. But it starts with the conclusion, then goes through the events, and then comes back to the end result of what happened. He goes through all the doubts that he had, right? All the doubts that he experienced. He's very, very clear about it. And then he goes into talking about, if I'd have talked about this at the time, I would have betrayed your generation. And then when is it? He comes into the sanctuary of God, and then he understands. He comes into the presence of God, and he understands what's going to happen to the wicked. And then he confesses what he was like, and then he concludes by saying, whom have I in heaven but you, and beside you I desire nothing on earth. But see, that's a conclusion he's reached after going through this long experience, and you get it in kind of a microcosm in Psalm 73. And so what this points to is when we come to the Psalms, not only do we need to read the whole Psalter, if you're going to go through the Psalms, don't just find a verse that's memorable. Don't just read poetry in the way it's never meant to be read, and that is by picking out a nugget and, sort of going to town on it. You have to read the Psalms, each one of the Psalms in their flow and in their shape, and then they'll start to make more sense, and they'll be easier to read and to deal with. Any questions so far? So similarly to what I said in narrative, don't begin reading a psalm by looking for the one main proposition that it's going to pop out of it as the main point. Now, Psalms are full of propositional truth, but it's not always the case that it's just spelled out for you in one line or one clause of a psalm. And so you have to read the whole psalm and try to carefully discern the structure of that particular psalm. Let's look at Psalm 31 together, as just as an example. And then we'll look at Psalm 119. I'd like to know what you're thinking when I say that, but in Psalm 31, you have, and if you read, I won't read all of it together. We won't read it all together out loud. The first 5 verses are all about David's call for help. So David calls for help, and then in the next section, basically sort of 6 through 8, there's statements about David's trust. So he calls for hope. It's not an empty call for hope. He calls out and then immediately follows that up with the hope that he has in God to deliver him. And then 9 through 13 is David's complaint about what's happening. I don't mean just carping about it, but it's his complaint. My eyes wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. My life is spent with sorrows, and my years with sign. My strength has failed because of my iniquity, and my body is wasted away. Because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. I'm forgotten as a dead man, out of mind. I'm like a broken vessel. For I have heard the slander of many. Terror is on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they schemed to take away my life. Things are not going well. But sandwiched between this, right? Sandwiched between this is his address to God, is his call for help, and then his statements about hope and trust in God. And then the complaints in 9 through 13 resolve themselves in this big, this sort of extended section on trust and hope. But as for me, I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. My times are in your hand, including all these years I'm spending in sorrows and tears and feeling like a dead man and being chased by my enemies. Those days are in your hands. Not just the good days. Right? So what David does here is he acknowledges in 9 through 13, things are going pretty rotten. And then he acknowledges in the verses that follow that nevertheless, my times are in your hand, including those times. Right? So this statement is, this psalm is making a powerful statement about the sovereignty and providence and nearness of God, but not in such a way that it just comes out and just spells it out in like a one-line definition. You get it through what? You get it through reading about David's experience and his reflection on it. And so that's what I meant earlier, is you don't really read it like, say, you do an epistle, where, say, if you're reading Ephesians 2, 1 to 10, it's pretty clear verse 7 is the main point. It arises as a main point out of the connections in the argument. We'll take a look at that later and see why. And we're talking about epistles. But see here, it's making a huge statement about why God can be trusted, and the fact that when life is as bad as it possibly can be, that does not mean that God is any further from us than anywhere else, or that those days are somehow out of control. Right? And that speaks to a common sort of human condition among believers, and that is we have this idea that God is really only close to us on the good days and not on the bad days. Right? But when we skip through the Psalms and just sort of read verse by verse by verse, the tendency is this: to read a Psalm like 131, read a Psalm like Psalm 31, to read this text I'm looking at right now, and not to follow, and it's not difficult to do. You don't have to have a master's degree in literature. But rather than sort of follow the flow of what's happening and considering the whole contents of the psalm, it's easy. It's easy to just sort of flow to verse 15. Just even one clause, my times are in your hand. They are. But the power of that is, my times are in your hand in the midst of verses 9 through 13. Right? Which were front-loaded with, I will rejoice and be glad in your loving kindness because you have seen my affliction. You know, and you have known the troubles of my soul. Right? It's sort of reciting God's track record. And not only that, he goes on to talk about the defeat of his enemies. And then verse 19, how great is your goodness, which you have stored up for those who fear you, which you have wrought for those who take refuge in you before the sons of men. You hide them in the secret place of your presence from the conspiracies of man. You keep them secretly in a shelter from the strife of tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he has made marvelous his loving kindness to me in a besieged city. As for me, I said in my alarm, I'm cut off before your eyes. Nevertheless, you heard the voice of my supplications when I cried to you. Oh, love the Lord. Now, see, here's his exhortation. See, it ends with this exhortation to all people who are going through the sorts of things that he's gone through, who are experiencing the same kind of life that he's experiencing. Now he calls out to them on the basis of his own experience of God's goodness in the midst of trial and says, oh, love the Lord, all you his godly ones. The Lord preserves the faithful. It's easy to talk about perseverance when things are going great. Right? When perseverance is a piece of cake, it's easy. I can persevere. I can persevere through a celebration any day. Right? On a day where everything goes my way, man, I'm persevering. I'm outstripping Paul in perseverance on a day that goes my way. The question about perseverance comes down is perseverance in light of verses 9 through 13, those kind of things. The Lord preserves the faithful. Why? Because perseverance is the work of God in our lives. And fully recompenses the proud. God will defeat. There it is. There it is. There's that refrain that you have in the Psalms again of God defeating his enemies and the enemies of his people. It doesn't go away. There it is. And, it's not just saying, I don't think the idea behind it is, God will give him a slap on the wrist. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who hope in the Lord. Right? So I just use this as an example. I just use Psalm 31 as an example. And this is a quick reading. It's not even a careful reading. We're not uncovering everything. We're not talking about every clause and every line, every section. We're not doing that. But just that sort of reading of the psalm that begins at the beginning, considers the shape of it, and then considers the sorts of things it's teaching as it flows through the experience of the psalmist. When we do that, we're rescued away from just sort of reading the Psalms for nuggets. Because if you read the Psalms for nuggets, you're going to get a sack of nuggets depending on your personality. You're either going to get the good nuggets. Where'd it go? My times are in your hand. And that's just one verse. Or you'll just get the seemingly negative nuggets, like the ones we read before. But you see, they're all together. They're all together. Not just in one psalm, but in the whole Psalter. And I think we're meant to read it that way. Now again, you can read any number of sort of hermeneutics books or books on the Psalms, and you'll see that the Psalms are categorized with, you have wisdom, messianic Psalms, imprecatory Psalms, Psalms of blessing, Psalms of woe, Psalms of celebration. There's all these categories. I think it's helpful, especially early on, to read that, and it makes you aware that there are various kinds of Psalms. There's not just one kind of Psalm. But I also think that the reader of Psalms can see that is true from reading them. And so I don't think those things are totally unhelpful. But if you come to a psalm and it's a wisdom psalm, okay, that's good. But just identifying as such doesn't mean all of a sudden you have the answer to how to interpret it. Right? But again, if you're thinking about the big picture of the Bible, the Psalms open it up and you hear the people of God speaking back to Him. Right? The majority of the Bible is God speaking down to us, but here you have us speaking up to God, people speaking up to God. But it's still what? It's still God speaking to us. It's God speaking to us through the voices of His people speaking to Him. Right? And so I think that's how, the big picture, again, it's not just a story out there that's spinning along. It's a story that has people in it who are living in it in every circumstance in life, from the most bitter tragedy to the highest of highs. Any questions about Psalms or poetry in general? Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is about whether every psalm points to Jesus. Well, let me answer it in sort of two steps. First, there are psalms that clearly point to Jesus, like Psalm 2, for instance. Or let's see. Let's look at a few more. Psalm 22 is another one. We'll talk about Psalm 22 near the end of the class, before we're done together. Near the end of the class, we'll talk about Psalm 22 in terms of reading the Old Testament and the New. There are also psalms like, let's get some good ones. You have all the royal psalms that are spread out throughout the whole Psalter. You have all the royal psalms that are talking about the king that all point to Jesus really, really clearly. It's interesting if you go to the book of Hebrews. I know that's not in Psalms, but if you go to the book of Hebrews, you see. If you go early on. Hebrews has disappeared from my Bible. Right? You get Psalm Psalm 2 right off the beginning, which clearly is pointing to Jesus. And then that psalm gets mixed with, say, like Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is the most quoted piece of the Old Testament in the New Testament. Right? It was clearly a favorite psalm of the early church, because they saw in it a clear picture of Jesus. Right? The Lord says to my Lord, Psalm 110, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies." Right? I think there you have this idea of scepter and rod. I mean, I think that stretches back to Genesis and the promise to Judah. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. The Lord has sworn He will not change His mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. The New Testament writers take the Psalms like Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 and putting them together, build the case for Jesus as king and priest together in one person. But see, these are in Psalms where it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear they're pointing towards Jesus. Now, I think the sense in which we say every psalm is about Jesus is when the psalms are praising God, and they do praise God. Our praise is always focused on and pointed towards God incarnate in Christ. That's how we understand what we know about God. Right? So there's not a sense, I think, when we're praising God in the Psalms that we're not praising God incarnate in Jesus. Right? What we know about God, we know through Him. When it's talking about God as Lord, God as Judge, God is vindicator of His people, God's loving kindness is forever and ever. All these things, these are all, I think, meant to be focused on the risen Christ. And in that sense, they're about Him. Right? Because, again, what we know about God, we know through Jesus. That's how God is revealed to us. So, in that sense, yeah, I think so. I guess it depends on what somebody may mean about every song points to Jesus. It does, I suppose, in some kind of, in general ways, yeah. Talking about God is going to vindicate His people, that vindication is going to come through Christ. God's going to rule over His people clearly, that ruling is going to come through Christ. God's going to punish His enemies. Jesus returns, we know from the book of Revelation and other places that Jesus is the one who returns in judgment over the enemies of God. So yeah, I think so. I think so, unless, did you mean something more specific than that? Yeah, sure, that's right. That's right, but of course there are psalms in there not written by David as well. You know, you have other psalms. But, for instance, my eyes just fell down here on Psalm 113, and I say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord from the time forth and forever. The name of the Lord is to be praised. The Lord is high above all the nations. His glory is above the heavens." Well, when I, honestly, as I need and want to read that as a Christian, when I read that, I think of things like, Philippians 2, 5 to 10. You know, or Ephesians 1, Jesus being given a name that is above every name and sitting on the throne. And so I think those prayers are directed towards, it's not towards a different God, of course. It's directed towards the way we know God, that is through Christ. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, I would agree with that. It's just, I guess, if somebody would mean by that, and this isn't what you're saying, I don't think, but if somebody would mean by that, for instance, Psalm 114:6, "O mountains that you skip like rams," "What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains that you skip like rams? O hills like lambs?" I wouldn't say that like the word lamb there is pointing towards, that's in Psalm 114:6, that the word lamb there is somehow pointing towards Jesus, the Lamb of God, takes away the sins of the world or something like that. But I don't think that's what you were asking, though. Okay. Anyway, that's a good question. But I think all of our worship and praise needs to be Christ-centered. I have an interesting cross-cultural aside on this, but I'll save it for another time. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. What do you do when you have Psalm 119? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk. Just let me repeat the question before you go any further so everybody can hear it, and then you can finish it. The question is concerning, like, when you preach an entire psalm, and then, for instance, the tradition, like when you read, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That the entire context is the entire context of that psalm is being assumed in the New Testament. Okay, finish. Yeah, that's, again, this is another one of those things when we talk about Old Testament and New and hearing allusions and echoes. This is about, again, the example is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Is that quote just that quote, or is it the context of the psalm? I absolutely believe that we're meant to hear the content of Psalm 22 when Jesus, and we'll see why. We'll see why when we do allusions and things in New Testament, Old Testament and the New Testament, near the end of class. You'll see why I think that. But I absolutely think that in that instance, the context is there. And it becomes pretty clear when you read it. Now, I don't think that means that every time you have a quote in the New Testament, there is necessarily the whole context of that quote there. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Often, if not most times, it is sort of the tip of the iceberg. But I don't muzzle the ox when it's threshing out the grain. I don't know that there's a lot of I don't know that there's a lot of reflection on the context of that. I mean, that's obviously quite a different one, right? It's easy to say. I can see why Psalm 22 is quoted here. But often you do have the context, and it's the context that helps us to understand the use of that quote, whatever it may be, or allusion or echo or something. We do have to be careful, though, because we can go overboard, and I have heard people interpret Old Testament quotes in the New, like Psalm 22, and at the end of the day, it's really the context that's being said, not that verse. Right? So it sort of becomes more about the Old Testament context than however that verse is functioning in the New Testament. Because just like the way you have, as I said earlier, you have the book of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah gets put into the Old Testament canon. It's recontextualized. Every quote and quotation from the Old Testament that's put in the New Testament is recontextualized. It doesn't throw the old context out, but it has its own context now, a new one, a denser context. And that's the most important thing. That's the most important thing that we have to focus on and hit on when we're interpreting that text. But again, we'll come back to this near the end of class. Anything else? Well, let's end our discussion with Psalms with Psalm 119. We won't read the whole entire psalm. People have often found Psalm 119 troubling when they understand, say, the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Yeah, I mean, many of you will know what I'm talking about. Because Psalm 119 talks over and over and over again about, the righteousness. It seems to talk over and over again about the righteousness that comes from the law and doing the law. And of course, he says lots of, I love your law. I love your statutes, right? I mean, it's this ringing endorsement of the beauty of God's commands. Teach me, O Lord, the way. I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to read randomly. Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will observe it to the end. Make me to walk in the paths of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart to your testimonies, and not to dishonest gain. Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity. How can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping it according to your word. With all my heart I have sought you. Do not let me wander. Here's a great one. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I love your law. You are my hiding place. I wait for your word. Your testimonies are wonderful. Therefore my soul observes them. The unfolding of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple. I opened my mouth wide and panted, for I longed for your commandments. Well, sometimes people have come to this and thought, it seems to be a little too positive about the law in light of Paul saying things like, we know that by the works of the law no one will be justified in God's sight. Well, I don't think the two things are antithetical. Because at no place, in no time, does Paul say that law is horrible and wicked. Right? He says the law is just and holy and good. And as we talked about earlier, the law uncovers, it unveils how God desires us to live. And remember also, the law is given in a relationship to where it's relational between the lawgiver and those who receive the law. It's not just them going through the motions of not murdering and other stuff. It's meant to be done out of fidelity, faithfulness to the one who gave it. And I think that's what you hear the reflection in this psalm. But it's only when we go to Psalm 119 and sort of hunt and peck about certain things they said that we don't see texts like some of the ones I read earlier. Verses, it's a calling out to God, make this true in my life. You hear that over and over in Psalm 119. Cause me to walk in your statutes. Reveal yourself to me. But not only that, Psalm 119 ends with a confession. Right? It's a psalm largely about the beauty of the law. Psalm 119, 169 says, let my cry come before you. Give me understanding according to your word. Psalm 119 is filled with the psalmist's recognition that he's totally dependent upon God to make this true in his life. There's never one hint of self-reliance in Psalm 119. Never a hint of it. Let my supplication come before you. Deliver me according to your word. Let my lips utter praise, for you teach me your statutes. Let my tongue sing of your word, for all your commandments are righteousness. Let your hand be ready to help me, for I have chosen your precepts. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is my delight. Let my soul live that it may praise you, and let your ordinances help me. And then the final word of Psalm 119. But as for me, I have gone astray like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I do not forget your commandments. Now, one time I had somebody arguing, they're talking about the perspective of the psalmist, and said, look, I'm not going to throw away all the stuff he's talked about how he keeps the law all the time just because of one verse at the end. And I said, well, I'm not throwing anything away. But the last verse at the end, the final word in the psalm is not one of self-reliance based upon the law. The final word of the psalm is, as for me, I've gone astray like a sheep. Seek me, find me. And you have all these other things of let me do this, give me understanding, let your hand be ready to help me. It's this total reliance and dependence upon God that flows out of Psalm 119. And the reason I think it does is he looks at the law and loves it because it's revealing God to him, but he recognizes that without God's help, without God empowering him to do it, he can't do it. He loves the law because he loves the God who gives the law. Not just because he loves a bunch of rules. Right? And again, it's this weird view that we have of the law. We're taught to view the law the way the Pharisees viewed the law, and that is apart from the lawgiver. And we insist on doing that. And so we can get really confused by things like Psalm 119, but the love expressed in Psalm 119 is a love for God who gives the law, not just a love for the law in and of itself apart from God. And that's why people have been able to say, people who believe in anything but justification according to works, that's why people who believe in justification by faith alone have been drawn so much to Psalm 119 and not afraid of it. Because what? It reveals God's righteousness. And not only that, if you read Psalm 119 as a new covenant believer, what's that mean? You're reading Psalm 119 as one who has had the Spirit poured out in your heart and been given a new heart. So you can say with Paul, we fulfill the righteous requirement of the law by the Spirit. We love loving God and loving neighbor from the heart. And so the law continues to reveal God's righteous character. The law reveals God in this, as I've said before, the law reveals God in this sort of holistic way. In terms of God, our relationship with God touching every iota of our life without anything left out. And so that's why I think the psalmist can look at the law and say, this is beautiful. Because it reveals God to me. But I've gone astray like a lost sheep. Rescue me so that I can follow your statutes. Is it bad that he's saying, I long to follow your statutes? I love your law. Is that bad? No. No. So I think if we will do away with thinking of the law the way the Pharisees did, in a sub-Christian kind of way, a sub-Bible kind of way, where it's just, here's the law, here's God, then Psalm 119 becomes a brand new psalm for us. But again, Psalm 119, when it comes to teaching and preaching, I wouldn't recommend that you say, today we're going to we're going to preach Psalm 119 and then you try to go verse by verse. It's not going to work. But I would recommend sometime that you preach Psalm 119 in a sermon. In a sermon, and make it alive for people. Everybody sort of jokes about it because it's the long one, right? And sometimes that can mean maybe we're not reading it, but the more you read, reading Psalm 119 is yet another example. And maybe it's the primary example of if you don't read the whole entire psalm, you can come away with a very, very skewed view of what he's saying about the law and what he's saying about his ability to keep it. Because once you get done reading Psalm 119, you don't come away with this view of here's a guy who's confident in his own self-reliant ability to keep the law. Or even less do you get the idea, here's a guy who is keeping the law knowing that as soon as he does it, then God's going to accept him. It's not that at all. If ever there was a vision of obedience to God flowing from love and desire for God, love for and desire for God, it's Psalm 119. So it teaches the New Covenant believer how we ought to be living. Obedience flowing out of a heart of acknowledgement and gratitude and love for the God who has saved us. Obedience isn't bad. It really isn't. It just has to be flowing from the heart. And then it's not a burden. And then you can say, I love your law. I love your commandments. Why? Because we should be loving, we should be wanting to live in a way that pleases the God who loves us. It's really, I think it really is that simple. Okay, so after, when we come back together, now that I hesitate to say now that we're done with Psalms, now that we've just opened a crack in the door to look at the Psalms, next we're going to go to wisdom literature, specifically Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So that's what's in store next.